Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Impact of the COVID-19 Pandemic on VET and its Transition to Digital Delivery. My name is Phil Lufter. I'm the Executive Manager in Form and Engage, and I'll be presenting today's session alongside my colleague, Melinda Lees, who's the team leader in the Research and Data Analytics area. Hello, Mel, how are you? I'm also very pleased that the NCVER researchers, Daniela Trimboli, Ian White and Tabitha Griffin, who were very much involved in much of the work that we'll be presenting today, have joined us online to assist us both in the discussion and also the Q&A session. So welcome to Daniela, Ian and Tabitha as well. And welcome you all. Just a reminder that we will be recording today's webinar, which will be made available on the NCVER portal shortly. Firstly, though, we wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continued spiritual connection to land. We pay our respects to elders, past, present and emerging. We very much welcome any First Nations people who are joining us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Today we're using GoToWebinar by LogMeIn. For those of you who aren't familiar with this platform, I'll briefly explain some of the components. To the left of the screen is the GoToWebinar viewer, through which you will see the presentation. To the right is the GoToWebinar control panel, where you can select audio mode and ask questions. To join the audio portion of today's webinar using VoIP, choose computer audio, otherwise select phone call. Using the questions panel to the right of your screen, you can submit written questions and comments online at any time. And for privacy reasons, only we can see your question. And we'll acknowledge all questions and comments submitted to us via the questions panel, either during the webinar directly today or afterwards through an email contact. Okay, so we'll now kick off the presentation. All right, so what we're going to do today is we're going to share this in effectively two parts. We're going to start with having a bit of a discussion of the impact of COVID-19 generally on the vet sector and how it performed during that period, and look at things like training provider delivery. And then we're going to move on to looking at things such as employer training choices, and also to give you some really interesting information around student participation and outcomes. And we're going to break it up into roughly two. So I'm going to start with the first part, and then my colleague Mel is going to go on to the second. And much of the information that we're presenting here today has been drawn from a range of different reports that we've undertaken here at NCVER, also supported by surveys, and we've listed some of them here in this slide, that were undertaken during the period of the COVID emergency and on various aspects of the vet sector. And a lot of this work was undertaken under the auspices of the Skills Senior Officials Network, where we did research directly to skills officials. And some of this is gleaned from our data. These reports are informed very much by our surveys and data collections for students, for apprentices and trainees. And if you have any particular interest in any of these reports, they can be found on the NCVER website listed on the URL on the last slide. So when the COVID-19 pandemic was first declared a pandemic or an international emergency in March 2020, I don't think any of us could have imagined or anticipated the extent to which it would impact on all aspects of Australian society, including the vet sector, nor for how long. The pandemic did, of course, go on for a lot longer than was first anticipated, and it involved a lot of shifting parts, some of which have changed since we did the analyses that we're going to talk about today. The vet sector has always prioritised practical experience and face-to-face engagement, and in 2023 we know that this characteristic was profoundly affected at every level during the emergency crisis period of COVID. It caused problems with things such as mandatory work placements, fewer students were enrolled and engaged, and it affected staff wellbeing and retention within training providers. It very much required a rapid deployment of online learning to ensure that learners could continue with their training. And training providers had to make significant changes in their business processes, including shifting wholly or partially to online delivery. And where face-to-face learning was actually possible, a large range of pandemic hygiene practices and protocols were needed to be rolled out. And of course, the experience was very, very different across different states and territories, depending on things like lockdowns and also government health orders at the time. In addition, the operating environment for registered training organisations was very challenging, with income and financial viability being tested, which lasted well into 2022. And especially in relation to apprenticeships and traineeship activity, there was a period where we saw contracts of training being suspended, some were cancelled, and commencements dropped. But as you'll see from some of the data that my colleague Mel's going to present, this recovered once the emergency declaration period ended. And our research has indicated that the vet sector showed considerable resilience and adaptability during the pandemic, and actually a range of new training requirements and opportunities were identified, which the vet sector is actually really quite well equipped to address. The information I'm about to provide was significantly drawn from a survey of 1,247 registered training organisations that we conducted jointly with the Australian Skills Quality Authority, ASQA, in 2021. And the two aims of that survey were to explore the extent of the shift online during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, including the challenges and opportunities experienced, and to examine the future intentions of registered training organisations in terms of delivering vet online in the longer term, so during the emergency period, but also as a more longer term thing. These next slides show what I think is really quite an impressive digital transition that occurred within our training providers. And this again was taken from that survey of RTOs conducted in 2021 that I just mentioned, and the analysis that was undertaken by some of our colleagues I just indicated. And their survey showed that 3/4 of those surveyed had shifted at least some of their training online. This might have included examples of parts of programs shifting online. It might have been all training and assessment was required to shift online. But in others, there may be certain programs that were shifted online, but not others. And of the about 25% who didn't shift to training online, this was usually due to things like the unsuitability of the online delivery for their subject matter, or the online delivery was not suited to the student cohorts that they were dealing with. Of the RTOs that were surveyed, almost half, I think it was about 49%, only delivered face-to-face prior to the pandemic. And these providers at the time were not delivering content online at all. But of these, 64% shifted to at least some training online during the height of the pandemic. And this was a significant shift for providers who at the time had possibly limited experience in delivering training content online. And of these, 70% introduced technologies, meeting platforms and the sort, such as Zoom, Microsoft Teams, while nearly 30% introduced learning management systems to facilitate the shift online. So training providers in the vet sector were very nimble and moved quickly to address you know, the COVID situation. This slide draws on the work that was undertaken by Tabitha Griffin and her team in 2021 and 2022, and reiterates what providers told us about their current and future training delivery. Firstly, we saw an appreciable increase in subject enrolments delivered through blended learning, which in the context of our research refers to the use of online delivery in combination with another delivery mode. In 2019, prior to the pandemic, it was around 23%, and in 2021, it had risen to close to 30%, about 29%. As seen in the second half of the infographic, over 60% of training providers indicated they were likely to use more blended learning going forward, and about 22% said that they would be likely to permanently shift more of their units or parts of their qualifications online. And the training providers we consulted with suggested these intentions were designed to maintain or to reach new students to help them with their financial recovery. Shifting training online, though, was not easy for all trainers, and this likely was exacerbated by the urgent nature of the shift at the height of the pandemic restrictions. And I think we saw that right across education and training. We certainly saw it in the school sector, we saw it in vet, we saw it in higher ed. So although 84% of RTOs who responded to this survey reported that trainers adapted well to the shift, there were challenges with things like designing and developing materials for online delivery, or they had limited experience with delivering training online before and had to pick these things up quite quickly. But now that the restrictions have lifted, a more considered approach to online delivery is now possible. And the feedback that we receive from RTOs is that there needs to be consideration of things like what teaching practices actually work well in the online environment for VET, how are students best supported in the online environment, and how are teachers prepared and supported to deliver training and support online. Final slide that I'm going to talk about before I hand over to my colleague Mel is around trainer readiness. It was acknowledged that even though RTOs reported that they felt that their trainers and assessors adapted really quite well to the changed circumstances brought about by the pandemic, it was really the pressure to shift quickly that presented the real-time pressures and difficulties, and to ensure that the training content was suitable for online delivery. But having said that, they still felt that they were able to meet the needs quite effectively. And there were challenges for many students as well in needing to adapt to online delivery, especially some students who might have lacked, for instance, some of the critical digital skills necessary to participate effectively in online learning. We found that over 70% of responding RTOs indicated that this was an issue, in addition to maintaining things such as adequate peer interaction and also an engagement in the online training environment. So just a few opening insights from me, and I'll hand over to my colleague Mel, who's going to take over from here.
Thank you, Phil. So the next section of this presentation explores the impact of the pandemic on employer training choices. The next few slides are based on data from NCVER's survey of employer use and views of the VET system. And this is a biennial survey that collects information about employers' engagement and satisfaction with the VET system and the various ways in which employers use VET to meet their needs. According to the survey, Australian employers engage with VET in a number of ways. So they have jobs in their workplace that might require vocational qualifications. They can employ apprentices and trainees. They use nationally recognised training to upskill their employees, and this is outside of apprenticeships and traineeships. And they may also use unaccredited VET to upskill employees. So when we look at how employers engage with training over the past 10 years, we can see that the proportion of employers engaging with any of these types of VET was at the highest point in 2021, with an increase in all measures from 2019. If we focus on the use of nationally recognised training during this period, we can see from the green line that 27% of employers use nationally recognised training other than through apprenticeships and traineeships in 2021, which was up 7 percentage points from pre-pandemic levels in 2019. And around 1 in 4 of these employers stated that the change was actually due to the impact of COVID-19. From the purple line, we can see that 27% of employers had apprentices and trainees in 2021, which was also up by 4 percentage points from 2019. And 1 in 5 of these employers stated that this change was due to the pandemic. So overall, 44% of employers surveyed reported that they had new training requirements because of the pandemic. And the industries most impacted by COVID-19 restrictions had the highest proportions of employers with new COVID-19 related training requirements. 72% of accommodation and food services employers reported having new training needs, And the second most impacted industry was healthcare and social assistance, with 67% of employers reporting new training requirements. And this was followed by the education and training sector, with 61% of employers reporting new training needs. Lesser impacted industries had lower proportions of employers with new COVID-19 related training requirements, which is as to be expected. When we look at the reasons why organisations had new training requirements, the top reasons that were reported in 2021 were to effectively and safely operate in the COVID-19 environment, with 84% reporting this. Also to train staff to undertake new tasks and responsibilities due to the pandemic, and the need to access training to help manage business operations under the COVID-19 environment. There are a number of areas that were covered by the new training requirements, and 71% of employers reported having new health and safety training needs. 68% had new infection and control skills training needs. 25% had new sales and customer service training needs, and this was particularly prevalent in client-facing industries such as retail trade and accommodation and food services, where over 40% of employers reported having this new requirement. And this is most likely due to that change that we saw in the way that staff had to interact with and serve customers under the COVID-19 restrictions. 19% of employers reported having new computing skills and data literacy training needs, and this was a lot higher in the education and training sector. It was 45% that said this, and this reflected the new skills that were needed by training providers to rapidly shift training content and delivery online during the pandemic. Both employers and training providers have shown themselves to be remarkably adaptable and innovative in their ability to provide training to the workforce despite the many challenges that they face because of COVID. Our research findings indicate that a sizable proportion of businesses are looking to training to help them recover and flourish in the post-pandemic economy. And this really presents an opportunity for VET and the sector to help address the new challenges that employers face. And some of these things include the need for organisations to fulfil COVID-19 operating requirements, for example, in particular in the healthcare settings, the technological change and the acceleration of digitisation of the workplace with the transition to online service delivery and remote working arrangements, and the utilisation of blended methods of training delivery, for example, striking that right balance between online and practical learning. So while we've now examined the impact of the pandemic on training providers and employers, this final section of the presentation explores the impact on student participation and their outcomes. In this section, we've undertaken a comparative analysis of 2019, 2020 and 2021 total VET activity enrolment data, completions data, as well as an analysis of data from our National Apprentice and Trainee Collection and our National Student Outcomes Survey. And we've then supplemented this data analysis with findings from our interviews with training providers and peak bodies. The overarching pattern of student enrolments during the pandemic showed a sharp decline in enrolments in the early stages of the pandemic before bouncing back in late 2020 and into 2021. And from the chart presented here, we can see an overall decrease of 6% from 2019 to 2020. And this was predominantly driven by a decline in domestic fee-for-service students, while government-funded students actually increased during this period. For most of the training providers that we interviewed, student enrolments declined in the early stages due to the lockdowns, high levels of uncertainty, difficulties with or reluctance to study online, and new income and employment pressures which forced students to withdraw from the sector altogether. And this was particularly the case for students from disadvantaged or vulnerable groups. From the chart, we can see an increase of 9% in total VET student enrolments from 2020 to 2021. And this actually rebounded to levels above pre-pandemic numbers, with increases in both government-funded and domestic fee-for-service students. Training providers reported that as the sector began to adjust to new modes of delivery and initiatives were introduced by governments in response to the pandemic, enrolment numbers began to recover and students began to return to the sector in late 2020 and into 2021. However, many providers indicated that students' reasons for returning to VET were quite different from their pre-COVID motivations, with students enrolling in training that they thought may lead to more secure employment outcomes or being inspired to embark on new career paths. And many of them actually want to take advantage of those government incentives that were targeted at specific industries. Recently released data for 2022 shows a further increase in total student enrolment numbers, which can be attributed to significant rises in domestic and international fee-for-service enrolments that were not delivered as part of a nationally recognised program, especially in health-related fields of education. When we analysed the change in enrolments by different equity groups, we found that all equity groups presented in the table here experienced a decline in program enrolments from 2019 to 2020, with above average declines for all groups except those that speak a language other than English at home. Many training providers listed Indigenous students as one of the first cohorts to withdraw as a result of COVID-19 and one of the most difficult to re-engage in the sector. From the data, we see that Indigenous students had the largest decline of 8.9% from 2019 to 2020, and they remained below pre-pandemic levels into 2021. Despite many training providers mentioning culturally and linguistically diverse students as being one of the most impacted cohorts during the pandemic, due to high levels of fear, additional caring responsibilities, and precarious living conditions due to visa arrangements and employment situations, the enrolment data for this cohort actually told a fairly positive story, with only 1.6% decline in LOT program enrolments from 2019 to 2020, compared to a 3% decline in total program enrolments. And while there was an overall decline of 5.1% in regional and remote student enrolments, training providers reported mixed impacts on this group. On the one hand, their geographical distance from high infection areas actually shielded them from the impacts of the pandemic, with some of these students able to continue to study with little or no interruption. And this was particularly the case for regional and remote students in Western Australia, Tasmania, and the Northern Territory. Students in remote or regional areas in the eastern states, however, told a very different experience, impacted by higher levels of community infections and the government's response to this. Training providers with students with low socioeconomic status reported limited access to digital technology, difficulty attending classes, and employment loss in their household as some of the reasons enrolments declined for this group from 2019 to 2020. The 2019 to 2021 data presented here highlights the additional challenges that COVID-19 presented for most of these student cohorts and the difficulty training providers faced in re-engaging these students during the pandemic. By 2021, program enrolments were still below pre-pandemic levels for most equity groups, while overall program enrolments were actually up 2% on 2019. We saw apprentices and trainees were particularly affected by the pandemic, with more than 1 in 5 reporting on-the-job training component of their study had been delayed due to COVID-19. From the chart on the left-hand side, we can see suspensions hit unprecedented highs in the first half of 2020, while on the right-hand side, we can see contract commencements were well below 2019 levels in the second quarter of 2020, which is highlighted in the purple bar. The increase in suspensions and the decline in commencements reflected the immediate economic impact of the pandemic and the subsequent government responses with a national lockdown and low levels of employer recruitment activity. The industries hardest hit by suspensions included arts and recreation services, accommodation and food services, transport, postal and warehousing, retail trade, and agriculture, forestry and fishing. By the third quarter of 2020, suspensions began to stabilise to pre-COVID-19 levels before declining further in the last quarter of 2020 in line with an increase in contract commencements. And this was with the introduction of the National Boosting Apprenticeship Commencement Subsidy Scheme and possibly some latent employer demand following the lifting of national lockdowns. And by the second quarter of 2021, suspensions had returned to pre-pandemic levels for most states and territories. The data presented on this slide reflects many of the observations reported by training providers regarding a student's ability to complete their training during the pandemic. From 2019 to 2020, we see a decline in the proportion of subjects passed or competency achieved passed in the table, an increase in the proportion of continuing subjects, and an increase in the proportion of subject withdrawals. The shifts in the data reflect the experience reported to us by many training providers, where some students stayed enrolled in training while facing delays in completing their mandatory workplace requirements, while others withdrew altogether due to the range of challenges that the pandemic presented to them. Between 2020 and 2021, the proportion of continuing subjects declined as lockdowns lifted and students were now able to complete the necessary components of their studies. Over the same period, the proportion of subjects passed increased, but the proportion of withdrawn subjects increased even further. Recently released 2022 data shows the proportion of subjects passed are nearly back to 2019 levels, as are continuing enrolments, while the proportion of subjects withdrawals remain above pre-pandemic levels. In contrast to what the data shows here, some training providers said that the pandemic enabled students to complete training at higher levels and at faster rates, with positive levels of completion seen for some jurisdictions and for some shorter courses that were designed to meet the emerging needs in response to the pandemic. The delay in training delivery and the ability of students to complete training resulted in a significant decline from 2019 to 2020 in the proportion of qualification completers employed or in further study after they've completed their training. The proportion of qualification completers with an improved employment status after training was also significantly lower than in 2019. However, the impact of the pandemic on employment and further training outcomes appears to have been short-lived, with these measures returning to near pre-pandemic levels in 2021. Despite the impact on completions, employment and further study outcomes, most students actually remained satisfied with their training during the pandemic period. Encouragingly, data presented here from NCVER's National Student Outcomes Survey shows a significant increase in 6 of the 7 key satisfaction measures for domestic qualification completers from 2019 to 2021. And these are highlighted in the last column of the table here. Students felt they achieved their main reason for training, they were satisfied with the training overall and the various components of the training in relation to the skills they obtained and how the training was conducted. Many training providers reported that maintaining student engagement and satisfaction during the pandemic was incredibly challenging. Various strategies were introduced by providers to support students whose study experiences had been forced to change dramatically. But these strategies appear to have been largely effective, with training providers indicating that student satisfaction remained relatively high despite the disruption caused by the pandemic. As we've shown in today's presentation, COVID-19 impacted the vet sector in Australia on many levels. It created a temporary drop in student enrolments, completions, and apprentice and trainees in training, all of which have since more or less recovered to pre-pandemic levels. The shift to online delivery was rapid, creating complexity for many RTOs. However, most reported this shift was necessary and will remain a permanent fixture to varying degrees. However, it is really important to understand that online delivery is not suitable for all learners or courses, and RTOs acknowledge additional support services are required in specific areas. The pandemic created some new training opportunities, particularly relating to health, sales, and customer services, as well as digital literacy. It also highlighted the importance of wraparound services to support and engage both staff and students, particularly vulnerable student cohorts. And that brings us to the end of our presentation today. We'd like to really thank everybody for their time in joining the webinar, and we'd like to open up to any questions.
All right. We've got a good question here, which was from one of our people here. Were there any data collected to showcase the stress factor that was underwent by all vet educators during the COVID-19 pandemic, whilst they were trying to cope with the rapid change over the teaching and learning from traditional to digital methods. So even though I don't think that was a specific focus of our work, Daniela, did you want to make a comment? Because I think the survey that you undertook did at least get some evidence from educators about how things went from their personal perspective.
Sure, and hello. Thank you, Phil and Mel, for that presentation, and hello to everyone who's joining online. Yeah, I can kind of speak to this indirectly in the sense that the interviews that Mel and I did for our project didn't speak to educators specifically, but we did speak to a lot of different training providers, and they did make comments about the way that their staff managed the transition to digital teaching. I guess the general sense was that it was very hard. And I do recall there was, a few comments, a few reports of some staff being unwilling to make that change and perhaps leaving for that reason. But often if they did leave, it was tied to other stresses that were going on in their lives as well. So I wouldn't say it was necessarily specifically about that digital transition. But yeah, certainly overall, I think that the story was that it was very hard, but the staff did a remarkable job in kind of upskilling in those new digital and blended modes. And sort of after a few months, they kind of adapted really well. And I think that that's actually a pretty similar finding in general to what Tabitha Griffin's and Sheila Hume's projects found as well, that it was challenging, but they did it.
Thanks for that. We've got a question here about what was the cause of that spike in apprenticeship cancellations and withdrawals, and is it connected to government incentives? I think I'll answer that. I think during the emergency phase of the pandemic, I think the reasons really were significantly linked to the cessation of economic activity. Because apprenticeships and traineeships are very, very tightly connected to the labour market, and as a result, especially in certain industries like construction, in retail, when economic activity slows down, effectively because of the nature of the contract, which involves significantly work, it really did see, a sudden spike. But as I think Mel presented in her data, once we returned to normal patterns of economic activity, then things started to kind of return to some form of normalcy. Do you have some questions there?
I do have a question. I think this one might be for Tabitha. One of the figures showed that the top two barriers to shifting online was the unsuitability of subject matter and that online delivery wasn't suitable for some students. Do you have any examples of what these unsuitable situations may be, Tab?
Yes, thanks, Mel. And this is something that we were certainly very interested in when we saw the findings from the joint survey with ASQA. And we followed up that survey with some interviews with some of the survey participants, and we explored what they were talking about with those issues. And I guess unsurprisingly, training courses that had a high proportion of practical work involved in them were difficult to transfer online. And so what a lot of RTOs in those situations were doing were putting the practical components, sort of delaying them while transferring theoretical components online. But obviously that had some implications later down the track when students came back into RTOs. They'd either forgotten, what they had learned, online, or it was, not in a natural order for them. So there were some continuity issues there. The other surprising, maybe things that we were not expecting as much were that some topics that are highly emotive in nature, so things that are dealing topics that are dealing with, you know, child protection, family and domestic violence and suicide risk and things like that were difficult to do online. RTOs raised concerns about their ability to provide the duty of care for students when delivering in that nature. And also topics, well, foundation skills was the other one that came up a lot, where RTOs felt that it was pretty critical to have students in a face-to-face environment to be able to do with that. And there were, you know, issues with language literacy and numeracy, and also digital skills obviously is really important when learning in an online context. And so some students would struggle in that sense.
Thanks, Tab.
I've got one here. Says, and thank you for this, from one of our webinar participants, that the pandemic, of course, has had a profound economic and employment implication globally and certainly in Australia. And what steps have been taken to ensure that VET programs align with the evolving skill needs of industries? I think I'll take that one. I think Australia is relatively well placed in terms of trying to understand what they are. I mean, a lot of the work that Jobs and Skills Australia are doing at the moment is focused on things like skills anticipation, so trying to kind of understand the skills supply and demand equation, so to speak, to try to work out what they mean in terms of you know, jobs that are emerging, you know, both from technology change, but also in addition due to the COVID pandemic. Some of the work that they've done, for instance, like their clean energy study, is very focused on what does that mean for Australia. And the work that JSA is doing is very much drawing on a lot of the supply side information that NCVER has. I think in addition, the role and function of the Jobs and Skills Councils, the JSCs, is very focused on this sort of stuff too, to kind of connect with the whole range of information that we've got now in terms of skill supply and demand, and to be able to make you know, some useful judgments on how education and training and certainly the VET sector can respond. And that really started, I think, with the pilots, you know, like Digital Skills Organisation, what have you, which have been very, very focused on new technologies, digitalisation, all that sort of stuff. So, and I think that it's just become that much sharper during the period of COVID. Have you got any other questions there?
I have another one that I think hopefully Daniela, you might be able to answer this. How has the COVID-19 pandemic reshaped the delivery and accessibility of VET programs in Australia? Are there any innovative strategies or technologies that have emerged to support VET during these challenging times, and how have they impacted student income? So perhaps the first part of that, Daniela, from the interviews.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Mel. Yeah, certainly accessibility became a real important talking piece in the interviews. And it was kind of interesting because, especially in that first stage of the pandemic, accessibility was impacted negatively in some ways, because we know, of course, that there is a real digital divide in Australia. So there were a lot of students who experienced access issues because they simply couldn't get online, or they didn't have the appropriate infrastructure at home, you know, the internet, the right kind of connection. Of course, this was exacerbated in regional and rural areas where some of the connection wasn't as good. On the other hand, there were some really good accessibility stories to come out of it, especially for students with disabilities and you know, other kinds of conditions that perhaps made it generally hard for them to be on campus. And there was a lot of talk around the positive impact that having blended modes offered, especially for students who could, you know, go more at their own pace. They could revisit recorded lectures, those kinds of things, and sort of digest the material in their own time. So that was a really good thing, I think. And the overall sense coming from the interviews at the time, which was in August, September 2022, was that would still continue, because it did enable a broader group of students, I guess, to engage in their training. In terms of innovation, I think there was an overall sense that training providers really felt quite excited about what this shift had enabled, in terms of suddenly they felt like there was even more things that they could perhaps do that they hadn't entertained before. So there was quite a lot of talk about AR and VR and how different augmented realities could be used within training, and what the possibilities would be there, and how that might also open up things like mandatory work placements if, you know, we see a similar kind of disruption happening to those in the future. So yeah, I think it kind of led to what we know was a paradigm shift in the digital sense in delivery, but it also offered some exciting possibilities in terms of, yeah, thinking through what could be possible. Thank you.
Daniela. And I have another question here, which I think is probably for you, Ian. With many employers reporting having new training requirements due to COVID-19, do training organisations appear to be able to move fast enough to meet employers' needs for upskilling and reskilling?
Yeah, thanks, Mel, and hi, Phil and Mel, and everyone online. So firstly, we should acknowledge that both training organisations and employers, they did prove themselves remarkably adaptable, responding to the challenges of COVID-19. You know, for example, many were able to adapt their training requirements and to online mode delivery while the pandemic restrictions were in place. In terms of accredited training, there's no doubt that employers, they'd like to see faster and more flexible qualification development. However, that's not necessarily under the control of the RTOs themselves, you know, because they're constrained by training package delivery and alike. What we generally did find is that to meet like really rapidly changing training needs, such as in the COVID-19 pandemic, employers, they'd often move outside the accredited vet system and turn to more like informal or unaccredited training. And that was just due to like flexibility, the speed they needed it, and just to meet their training needs.
Thank you, Ian.
We've got a question here, and thank you to our participants for sending them through. Just asking, in terms of longer term impacts, were there any particular industries, subject areas or levels of qualification that might be more likely to retain online delivery than others? My personal experience is that it really was pretty general. Ian, have you got any perspectives on whether or not there were any particular you know, levels of qualifications or industry areas or subject areas that are more likely to retain online delivery now we've actually moved away from the emergency period of the pandemic?
I think it's Tab.
Oh, Tab, is it?
Yeah, I can. It's Tabitha here. I can jump in and answer this to some degree. While I can't talk across all qualifications, we did a follow-up piece of work recently. It was published earlier this year, where we took a sample of qualifications. We had 8 qualifications that we were interested in across different levels, and we were interested in how they were being delivered online and how student support was being provided to online students. And we spoke to trainers who were delivering these 8 qualifications, and so these spanned quals that were in community pharmacy, skills for work and vocational pathways, fitness, early childhood education and care, electrotechnology for electricians, real estate practice, and the TAE and accounting. So it was a fairly broad range of quals that we looked at. And talking to trainers, we found that most of them were adopting some level of online delivery in these qualifications. And they were certainly being a little bit more considered about their approach post-COVID than what they were in that dramatic shift during the pandemic, of course. And so they were thinking about how they could really develop the materials to be suitable for an online learning context rather than face-to-face. And so they were changing how they were delivering these quals. There were two that came out as, I guess, having very divergent views from our participants about whether they were suitable for online delivery or not. The first being the electrotechnology one. Obviously, you've got very practical workshop type skills that need to be taught, which you can't do online. We don't expect people to be able to do that online. But there was even some disagreement around whether the theoretical components of that qualification could or should be delivered online. Some were doing it, some were doing it that in a self-paced manner, so that employers and apprentices could choose the best time to do this training. But some trainers believed that this should be done face-to-face with trainer support, basically next door to the workshop, so that that context could happen. The other one was the Certificate 2 for Skills for Work and Vocational Pathways. Some trainers believed that this should absolutely always be face-to-face, that it was much easier to build rapport with the types of students that they were getting in those courses. But there was an RTO that was just starting to offer this as a fully online course, but with ready access to trainer support for students. It was too early to be able to determine the success of that, but it would be a very interesting thing to go back and look at again. So that's a little bit of a snapshot of what we found in our most recent work.
Thank you, Tab, and thank you everyone for sending through your questions and for stimulating some really good conversation and some great insights there from the researchers that actually conducted interviews at the time that the studies were undertaken. I'm just going to hand back to Phil now to finish off today's webinar.
Okay, well, look, thank you, everyone. Thanks to our participants for your time today in being with us. I just wanted to indicate that a short online evaluation survey will be sent by email, and of course, we'd appreciate it if you could take the time to provide any feedback you'd like, as this will help us improve your experience next time. I'd very much like to thank everyone for participating in today's NCVER webinar, certainly our online participants. Thank you so much for your time. But also to my colleagues here at NCVER, including Melinda Lees. Thank you, Mel. And the terrific team at NCVER who undertake our research and data analytics, including Daniela, Tabitha and Ian, and also to thank my crew that were responsible for putting together today's webinar, which includes Alice and Joe, who are essential to making sure that they organise the event and it works effectively. And really just remember to stay connected with NCVER through our social media or on our website at www.ncver.edu.au. And I wish you all a good afternoon and thank you.